It hits you sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That feeling the world's changing like incredibly fast. You try to keep up, but one thing connects to a dozen others, maybe miles away.
Hmm.
And staying properly informed, well, it can feel like you're just getting buried in information. You want the real insights, the stuff that matters, without all the noise.
Absolutely. And it's that interconnectedness. That's the key thing now. What happens over here really can affect things everywhere else, often in ways you just wouldn't predict. We're all tangled in this global web.
Right. And that's exactly why we do the deep dive. We want to be your guides through all that complexity. We do the digging for you, through those dense academic papers, the research, and we pull out the crucial bits, the moments that make you go, oh. The goal is just a clearer path to understanding, not more overload.
Yeah, and today we're really tackling a big one. The major forces that are shaping our world right now. We've dug into a whole range of sources. We're looking at global conflicts, international alliances, human rights, democracy movements, even geopolitical theories, technology's impact, and what might be coming down the line.
So our mission really is to pull all this together and give you a clearer, maybe more nuanced picture of the big dynamics playing out in world affairs today. Okay, so where do we even start with something this massive?
Well, maybe we should step back first. Look at the big shifts in the global landscape. I mean, the early 2000s were just pivotal, weren't they? You had 9/11, the rise of China and India, the Arab Spring, climate change becoming undeniable. All these things really highlighted how interdependent, how complex, and honestly, how unpredictable the world had become. It shook things up.
It really did. It changed the way we looked at global events. There was this growing feeling that, what was happening was just too important to leave only to the diplomats and spies. We needed new ways to think about it all, new ways to make sense of these huge global processes.
And what's interesting is how around then there was this renewed focus on maybe civilizational differences playing a role. Now, it's not always about a literal clash, but it's recognizing that these deep differences in, say, culture, religion, ideology, values, they really shape how states and societies act and react.
So it's more than just knowing countries have different traditions. It's understanding that these fundamental differences actually shape how they see threats or opportunities.
Yeah.
How they understand the world dictates their response.
Precisely. It's that cognitive framework, how a whole society sees its place, sees others' motivations, that really drives what they do internationally.
Okay, that makes sense. So moving from that big picture down to global conflicts, it definitely feels like the end of the Cold War didn't quite the peace everyone hoped for, did it?
Yeah. No, indeed. In fact, the time right after the Cold War saw quite a rise in ethnic and nationalistic conflicts. The world kind of got smaller in that way. These local fights, often based on old grudges, suddenly seem much more visible and often much more intense.
And the sources we looked at mentioned xenophobia, that sort of deep-seated anxiety, even hostility towards people who seem different. It's a pretty stark reminder of how easily those divisions can be, used, and how that anxiety can show up everywhere, from individuals right up to international tension.
It really highlights that even when we talk about geopolitics in abstract terms, it often comes down to very human things: fears, prejudices, emotions. And as you said, the history of conflict is long and varied. The reasons behind it are often a messy mix: economic gain, political power, ethnic dominance.
Yeah, and the deep dive mentioned current conflicts, specifically Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's interesting how people interpret these differently. Are they about long-term imperial goals, or is it more about a big power trying to keep control in a changing world? Those are very different takes. Yeah.
That really gets to a key point about interpretation, doesn't it? Are these long wars driven by some strategic imperial desire, or are they more like reactions from a dominant power trying to manage instability and just keep things steady? The answer really depends on your viewpoint, your theory, how you read history.
And the Jordan case study was fascinating. It really grounded the geopolitics at a specific place. Its relationships with Israel and Syria are just so tangled. You've got treaties, domestic politics, old arguments about land, economic links, all overlapping. Even how others see Jordan from the outside plays a part, sometimes negatively.
Exactly. Jordan is such a good example of how one country's foreign policy is this incredibly delicate balancing act. It's shaped by history, by competition for things like water, by its own internal politics. It's like a mini version of the complex global picture, showing how all these different pieces connect.
Okay, so we've looked at what drives conflict and how we interpret it. Let's shift now to how countries try to manage things through alliances. It seems clear that these pacts, whether it's defense treaties like NATO, big trade deals, or just diplomatic agreements, They really shape how countries deal with each other.
Oh, absolutely. Alliances can totally change the power dynamics, create new influential groups. NATO is a really interesting case, mostly seen as successful, right? Initially, it helped calm fears in Western Europe after World War II, that whole security dilemma thing. And then later, when it expanded into Central Europe, that went hand in hand with and arguably helped those countries becoming more democratic.
But that expansion wasn't universally popular, was it? The sources mention counter-alliances popping up, like the CSTO and the STO.
Exactly right. And that fits with theories suggesting states will often team up to balance against a perceived threat or another power getting too strong. Though interestingly, the CSTO seems to be more of a place for its members to talk and negotiate rather than a really tightly knit military pact like NATO. The SKO has a wider brief: security, economy, culture.
And then you have the European Union, which is just such a unique case of economic ties growing into something much, much bigger.
Yeah, the EU's journey is pretty remarkable, from mainly economic cooperation to this, well, substantial transnational governing body with real legal and political clout. Those dense economic links built a lot of trust and made war between members seem almost unthinkable. It's a powerful example of shared interests breeding peace.
The UN also came up a lot, especially its traditional peacekeeping role. It's interesting how, historically, that was all about non-enforcement, getting everyone to agree, staying neutral on the ground.
Right, and it's important to see how that classic model has had to adapt since the Cold War ended. We've seen more willingness to include enforcement measures in UN mandates sometimes, reflecting how conflicts have changed and the pressure to step in during humanitarian crises.
Looking beyond Europe, the discussion on Asian alliances was really insightful. We heard about Japan's normative power, its influence through values and economy, China's stated peaceful rise, and the U.S. taking a more, well, assertive stance in the region. Sounds like a recipe for some tension there.
Precisely. And what's really key to watch there is this idea of regional resilience. How do these countries manage to stay deeply interconnected economically and avoid major wars despite these tensions and outside pressures? Things like RCEP, the big trade deal, and the ASEAN Plus 3 group, they're really important for building that shared economic interest, that resilience.
Okay, all of this kind of leads us naturally into the big theories in international relations. It seems scholars have been wrestling with these questions forever. Why do states fight? When can they actually cooperate?
For a very long time, yes. You have interest-centered theories, like the balance of power idea. They basically suggest states act mainly in their own interest. Sometimes that leads to conflict over resources or influence. Other times it leads to alliances to deter threats. Classical realism, for instance, tends to see conflict as almost natural, just part of power politics.
Which sounds quite different from the idealist view. As I understand it, idealists think we can build institutions and laws for peace, that war isn't inevitable, but maybe comes from bad systems or aggressive leaders.
Exactly. Realism, with its view of an anarchic world where everyone's out for themselves and power is key, it offers a more, shall we say, pessimistic outlook. Idealism holds out hope for cooperation, for managing things through shared rules, laws, organizations.
And kind of bridging these views is diplomacy, right? Basically talking and negotiating between states.
Yeah.
It sounds like this really complex dance, part competition, part trying to find common ground.
It is. And what's really interesting is how a country's own political culture can shape how its diplomats negotiate. Different societies just have different norms about using power, about bargaining, about what a successful agreement even looks like.
Let's shift gears to something fundamental: human rights. The data we saw comparing support for human rights across countries was quite eye-opening.
It certainly was. You see real differences from country to country in how much people support things like political participation or freedom from torture. Generally, though, wealthier nations that say they protect human rights tend to show more public support for those rights. Places like Norway, Denmark showed high support. Others like Taiwan, South Korea, even the U.S. showed lower support in some areas.
And it's a reminder that so many things influence how a society views human rights: culture, religion, tradition, protest movements, even how well the economy is doing.
Yes, and what was also quite striking was this gap sometimes between countries saying they respect human rights and how much attention or resources actually go into tracking and reporting on them, particularly that difference between the global north and south. It makes you wonder whose problems get prioritized internationally.
The UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights was mentioned as this key foundational document, laying out those basic rights everyone should have.
Absolutely. It's a vital benchmark, the world's aspiration for human dignity. But, as we know, awful violations still happen: mass killings, torture, exploitation. corruption, unfair imprisonment, discrimination. And the sources really stress the moral duty, the imperative for the international community to try and prevent these things.
Yeah, it's not just governments working on this. The influence of NGOs, the non-governmental human rights groups, seems to be really growing. They play a big role in setting agendas, raising awareness, putting pressure on the UN and on governments to do better.
Definitely. Their power comes from investigating, documenting, publicizing abuses, and advocating for change. They're becoming really important players. That Nairobi +5 meeting, focusing on women's rights, really showed their impact in holding governments accountable.
Okay, let's pivot again to democracy movements. It's easy to just think of democracy as elections, but the sources reminded us it often comes out of big upheavals, even revolutions.
That's absolutely right. Modern democracy often grew out of struggles for freedom. And it's interesting how U.S. foreign policy has often tied its own interests to spreading democracy, looking at places like Pakistan, Kenya, Georgia. But, well, the experiences of those countries show how complicated it is to build stable democracies. They faced real challenges.
And it became really clear that just having elections isn't enough for democracy to stick. You need strong, effective state institutions, courts, civil service, rule of law to make it last.
Yeah, we looked at some varied examples of democracy movements, like the German Revolution after World War I, end of the empire, start of a republic, fueled by anti-war feelings, or the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, a surprisingly peaceful military coup that led to democracy. And more recently, the Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011, where huge protests against corruption and joblessness brought down the regime, though the aftermath was complicated.
But democracy feels like it's facing more headwinds today. The sources mentioned potential new anti-democratic alliances forming globally, even talk of a new kind of Cold War, maybe along civilizational lines, and some pushback against the idea of actively promoting liberal democracy everywhere.
Those are definitely big challenges. That optimism after the Cold War, the feeling that liberal democracy would just spread everywhere, that's certainly been challenged by, well, new kinds of authoritarianism and big power competition.
Okay, let's get into geopolitical theories. It sounds like the way people think about geopolitics today has changed quite a bit from the older classical ideas.
Yes, contemporary geopolitics often tries to be more, let's say, scientific, more systemic in how it looks at international relations. That's maybe different from classical geopolitics, which could sometimes be more political or even speculative. The focus now is often on figuring out the root causes of conflict between nations and developing strategies to boost national power and security in this complex world.
We heard about the heartland theory, Mackinder's idea about the Eurasian world island and how controlling that huge landmass is key. His ideas about it uniting and dividing over time.
Right. And then you contrast that with Spikeman's rimland theory. He shifted the focus to the coastal areas, the rimland around Eurasia. Spikeman argued that area where land and sea power meet is the really crucial zone for interaction, competition, economic growth, and so strategically maybe even more important than the heartland itself.
And finally, geoeconomics. That's basically seeing economic relationships as tools for state power, right? Economic competition as part of the game.
Exactly. Geoeconomics looks beyond just military and political power. It includes things like trade deals, financial policy, control over resources, seeing all those economic tools as vital instruments for states to gain influence on the world stage.
It feels almost impossible to talk about the modern world without talking about technology's impact. It seems like new tech offers both huge opportunities and big challenges for governments.
It certainly does. You know, there was all that early optimism about the internet being this great democratizing force, empowering people against authoritarian states. But the reality turned out to be, well, a lot more complicated. We've seen governments get pretty good at regulating, monitoring, even using online spaces for their own ends.
And the whole online dynamic has shifted too, hasn't it? Maybe less open criticism, more whistleblowers selling secrets, and even things like political memes having a real effect on how people talk about issues.
And cybersecurity. That's become absolutely central to national security now. It's right up there with worries about food or energy supply. States are competing in cyberspace now. It's a whole new arena for geopolitical struggle.
And social media's role in politics.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's changed how politicians reach people, how campaigns run. But there are big risks too, right? Like more polarization, people getting stuck in filter bubbles or echo chambers.
That's a crucial point. These platforms can be great for organizing and outreach, but their algorithms can also maybe unintentionally, divide society further by just showing people things they already agree with.
So finally, looking ahead, what key future trends did the sources flag is really important to watch in world affairs?
Well, there was a strong emphasis on needing to look beyond just the traditional geopolitical or civilizational boxes to really grasp what's coming. Things like development geography, how economy and location interact, economic competitiveness, surveillance tech, computing power. These are going to be huge factors.
And the continued rise of emerging powers, especially India and China, their growing economic and political weight, and how different their systems are from the established powers. That's clearly a major ongoing shift.
And we can't ignore the multiple crises facing us, can we? Financial instability, growing inequality, deep ideological divides. These all have the potential to create more instability, more conflict globally.
And of course, climate change. It came up again and again as this critical, overarching threat to global security. Its impact on the environment, on people, on international relations.
Absolutely. Climate change isn't just environmental. It's a massive geopolitical challenge. It's likely to cause resource shortages, drive migrations, force new kinds of cooperation, but also new kinds of competition in the years ahead.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it feels clearer than ever that understanding all this geopolitics world affairs, it's just essential. It's the toolkit we need to navigate this interconnected world, to make sense of the challenges and, yes, the opportunities ahead.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground today. The changing global order, why conflicts happen, the role of alliances, different political theories, the fights for human rights and democracy, geopolitical thinking, tech's impact, and those big future trends like rising powers and climate change.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about all these powerful forces we've talked about, which one do you think will actually have the biggest impact on your own life, your own community in the coming years? It's a tough question, no easy answer, but we really encourage you to keep thinking about these vital issues.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the forces shaping our world.